Thank you. I'm delighted to be speaking here today. I'm going to talk about election polling in the 2016 election. And my first thought about this is, well, to what extent do you all want to hear about the 2016 election again, and opinion polling and all the mispredictions and so forth? On the other hand, Donald Trump seems to like to talk about this continually, even though the election has long passed. So what happened in 2016? 2016 arguably was the biggest debacle of predictions of elections of all time in the United States. It harkens back to the 1948 election, where there was this famous photo, which you'll see further in a second, of the Chicago Tribune reporting that Dewey defeats Truman. That is, Republican Thomas Dewey defeated Harry Truman in the 1948 election based on pre-election polling and predictions. And it's useful to think back historically on this. In particular, I think the best analyst of this is the legendary baseball player and language master Yogi Berra, and I think he had it right. And the terms, his phrases that apply here are, in 2016 compared to 1948 was déjà vu all over again, but the similarities are different, and of course the all-encompassing fallback is hard to predict, especially about the future. Now, to put this in broader historical context, I want to go back to 1936, which before 1948 was a polling debacle of a particular sort that's worth reflecting further on. From 1916 to 1936, the Literary Digest did what they called straw polls on presidential elections. These were polls based on mailing out cards to basically 10 million or more people. The people were selected by their subscriber list, by automobile registration, telephone directories, and also voter lists. Now, these constituted, by current standards, biased samples in the sense that they just sent out cards to as many people as possible and let people self-select whether to send in their cards. And despite that self-selected kind of sample, which arguably was more of an upscale sample, that is, people had telephones, people had cars, and so forth, you would think that would introduce certain kinds of biases, and biases of the sort that comport to the stereotype of Republican voters who were more, at least in those days, more middle class and upscale. So there were apparent potential biases there, but from 1916 to 1932, the Literary Digest correctly predicted the results of national elections. So in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took office, he's on the front page of the Literary Digest, they got it right. Come 1936, they're doing their poll once more, but what happens there, they predict that Alfred Landon would win the election. However, the upstart, George Gallup, began doing what he called scientific polling based on sampling of geographic locations and sending interviewers out to those locations to fill certain kinds of demographic quotas based on age and gender and other characteristics. And Gallup argued that his method was more scientific and that his prediction of the election would be right compared to the Literary Digest. And he predicted, based on his pre-election polling, that Roosevelt would win the election and not Landon. And he consistently had Roosevelt ahead in the polls, as you see in the chart. And at the same time, other legendary pollsters, Archibald Crossley and Elmo Roper, were entering the polling game using methods similar to Gallup and were making the same kinds of predictions. Well, what happened as a result of the election? George Gallup became famous. He got the election right. The Literary Digest got it wrong. What happened afterwards was that the Literary Digest went under in 1938. Scientific polling, with the word scientific in quotes, established Gallup as a major figure in public affairs and in polling and so forth. But there was that. But the question is, well, why was the Literary Digest wrong in 1936 and not earlier? And what happened was there was a major political realignment such that the kinds of biases that existed in the polls were correlated with how people voted. And so what happened was the Literary Digest overestimated the Republican vote. What also happened that people don't fully appreciate is that Gallup underestimated Roosevelt's support by fully 5 points. In the graph that you saw, he was actually 5 points 5 points short. So Gallup's poll had those actually similar kinds of biases, but he got the winner right. And he got the winner right in 1940 and 1944, but again, underestimated Roosevelt's support. So there were problems in the polls that then came home to roost in 1948. In 1948, prior to the election, the Gallup polls had predicted that Dewey would win by somewhere around 5 points in the election. And other pollsters were getting the same kinds of results, including academic pollsters who were analyzing the election as well. And what happened there was there were obviously problems in the Gallup poll. The uproar was so great. There were uproars in government, there were uproars all throughout society, and it prompted the Social Science Research Council to put together a committee to investigate the pre-election polls of 1948, headed by a famous statistician named Frederick Mosteller. So the big question is, what did the SSRC report find? Well, they found the following things. The biggest problem they found was what they argued were biases in the polls that led to Gallup and others interviewing upscale voters more than downscale voters, introducing the same kinds of biases that we had seen all along through 1944. And the bias came in not because of the selection of geographic locations, but because the interviewers had discretion with regard to what people they would interview and talk to. And the more interview-friendly looking people tended to be more middle class and upscale, and the interviewers would gravitate toward those people. So that was the first problem. The other problem, and this speaks to what I call to be polite, the lack of humility, or to be less polite, the arrogance of the pollsters and predictors because of the confidence that they had in their polling methods and the fact they had gotten prior elections right. And the arrogance was such that they stopped polling 2 weeks before the election. And it turned out there was a lot going on in those 2 weeks in terms of the campaign. Truman was actively campaigning. There was a sense that the tide was turning. It may sound a little familiar to what happened in 2016, but we'll get there in a second. And so the fact that they stopped polling early, that was considered a problem as well. Further, there's always the problem in how to allocate undecided voters. So that was a major problem, and we'll come back to that today. And in addition to that, it's always difficult, and this speaks to Yogi Berra's comment about it's being difficult to predict, especially about the future. It's difficult to predict what the electorate on election day is going to look like based on pre-election polls. So there was at this time this exaggerated impression of the accuracy of polls, and that led to the reporting and projecting of the polls and the election to turn out in a certain way, and it didn't. So there was a major problem there. Gallup thereafter corrected his methods and in subsequent years was able to better predict the polls. In the 1958 election, the Gallup polls were within 1 point of Dwight Eisenhower's victory over Adlai Stevenson. Following that, there were further advances in survey research, leading to the proliferation of polling, the shifting from in-person interviews to telephone surveys, the use of random digit dialing, computer-assisted interviewing, and so forth. And up until a point, there were sufficiently high response rates so that the quality of polls was good. But what happened afterwards was that because of the proliferation of polling, through the proliferation of solicitation calls and other kinds of calls that people get, there's been a decline over the years in response rates to surveys, especially in the modern day with the proliferation of cell phones in the United States. Today, there are more than 50% of the households in the United States that are cell phone only, so that the pollsters had to start calling the people on cell phones. People were less likely to talk to pollsters on cell phones. There are other issues involved in cell phones as well. So that the response rates began to decline, and there were worries about increasing errors in surveys. And these were compounded in the 2016 election by other factors, including especially the ability of the pollsters to identify the nature, the composition of the electorate in the 2016 election. The other complication in the 2016 election was for lack of a better term again, arrogance associated with projections about how the election would occur because of what was referred to as the blue wall that the Democrats had. Now, Obama was able to win substantial electoral college majorities in 2008 and 2012. He was able to win the key states of Ohio and Florida. And in addition, he won North Carolina and Indiana in the 2008 election. And so in the electoral map that you see, there's a lot of blue there. And the blue there is such that it basically gave the Democrats, many different ways of winning the Electoral College. If you go back to the 2000 election, there's a big uproar about what happened in Florida, and had Al Gore won Florida, he would have won the election. But what people forget is that Gore could have won the election without Florida if he had taken his home state of Tennessee, or if he had taken the state of New Hampshire. So that fast forward to the 2016 election, there were a great many ways that Hillary Clinton could win the election. In the blue that you see in the map in front of you, you see a lot of blue there. But if we eliminate the states of Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, and Iowa, Hillary Clinton could have still won the election. The key things being, the key difference between the 2000 election is that the states of Colorado and Virginia have become Democratic states. It was always assumed, because of decades of election results, that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania could never go Republican. That was assumed. And so the worst case scenario would be if she lost North Carolina, Florida, and Ohio, but as long as she took the states, and Iowa, and as long as she took the states of New Mexico, Nevada, and New Hampshire, she could win the election. And if you look at what happened in the 2016 election, she in fact lost North Carolina, Florida, Ohio. She won Nevada and New Hampshire, and would have won the election except for one small detail. She lost Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And that's what no one saw coming. So what happened in the 2016 election? There were all these wild predictions of the probability of Hillary Clinton winning, ranging from 71% to 99%, based on simulations of Electoral College results, based on the pre-election polling. The problem was that the polling in key states was error-ridden. You remember the uproar that the election caused? That led, of course, to a report that was just completed by the American Association for Public Opinion Research. ISERP had actually put together a task force to do a report on the 2016 election polling, not expecting any surprising results, but they were confronted with a major surprise. So it basically shifted the focus of the report that was done by a blue ribbon committee of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, as you see listed here. And the big question is, what did they find? Well, what they found first and foremost was that the national polls were generally accurate by historical standards. That is, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2 percentage points, and the polls had her winning by 3 or 4 points. And that 2-point difference was similar to historical averages. And actually, the polls in 2016 were better than the polls in 2012. And that's something that got lost in the shuffle. The problem is that the states had a bad year, and in particular, there was a bad year in the key states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Now, the problems with the polls, this particular slide basically shows that the polls had her winning by an average of 2 points based on polls by different polling organizations. The error that was found in the polls, the magnitude of the error was basically about 2.2 percentage points, with a bias in favor of Hillary Clinton. In the graph that you see, that the orange line represents the magnitude of the error, and the blue bars represent the bias, the direction. So there was an overestimate of the Hillary Clinton vote. If you go back and look at 1936, by the way, there was a huge underestimate of the Democratic vote, even though in 1936, 1940, and 1944, the Gallup poll got the winner right, but it got the winner right, but by margins that were substantially off. In the states, the results were different. The magnitudes were on the order of 5 percentage points, which is a lot, and that's an average. In some states it was bigger, in some states it was smaller, and the bias was in the direction of the Democrats. That is, they underestimated Donald Trump's vote. And the problem that occurred has to do with the quality of the polls, which for me, and this isn't cited in the report, is indicated by the fact that in the last 2 days before the election, there were 11 high-quality public opinion polls that were done nationally. In contrast, in the states in the last week before the election, in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, there were just a handful of polls. And the quality of those polls, the ISERP report called into question. What had happened in the election Well, there were a lot of things that the ISERP report cites. One is voters broke in the last week of the election more toward Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton. Based on the exit polls, people who decided late in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania disproportionately voted for Donald Trump. In addition, there was a question of what happened with regard to voter turnout in the state and the representativeness of the samples. What they did find is that one problem in the polls is that the polls in the states, in many cases, did not weight or adjust their data statistically for education. That is, white voters without a college degree voted disproportionately for Trump, and their non-response to the polls was not compensated for by any weighting. In addition, and this isn't in the report, but based on the latest census data, we know that voter turnout among African-American voters was less, and what we also know from the exit polls is that African-American voters supported Hillary Clinton at slightly lower rates than they had supported Barack Obama, and the same thing for Latino voters. And in addition, what the ISERP report cited, in some states there were what are called ballot order effects. There were states in which Trump was disproportionately listed first on the ballot, and that may have led to some slight biases. And then last, but not least, the report talks about this, but I think understates it. The big problem was not so much in the polls themselves, but in the reporting and in the exaggerating, or the perceived exaggerating, of the likelihood that Hillary Clinton would win the election, and the fact that that people did not fully appreciate sampling variability and probabilities. In the 1948 report, in the Mosteller report, they talked also about the lack of appreciation of variability and survey error, particularly among the reporters and predictors of the poll results. 71% is not a prediction that Hillary Clinton would win is not a slam dunk, but if you repeat 71% enough online and on network news and on cable news, people get the impression that she was a shoo-in, and that perception was a big part, I would say the most significant part of the debacle that occurred. And the final conclusion of the ISERP report is that election polls are not all polls. What the pollsters all worry about is that when they fail to predict elections right, people lose faith in polling. In this election, the national polls were reasonably accurate, but more importantly, election polls are different from all polls in the sense that you're trying to make predictions and weight or adjust your data to an electorate that you don't know. Whereas normal public opinion polls that are done between elections and don't focus on elections are samples of the adult population for which we have census data to benchmark what the composition of the public is. So there should be much less error in polling overall compared to election polls. What are predictions about the future quality of surveys given declining response rates and other issues in polling? That's a topic for another occasion. If you want to read about this further, you should see the latest Pew Research Center report entitled What Low Response Rates Mean for Telephone Surveys. The basic finding of that study is that, for the most part, good high-quality polling could be done, but there's certain kinds of problems that we need to be cognizant about. Thank you.